For those of you who have just joined on now for session 2, I'm Michaela, and I'm primarily a co-organizer of Youth Fusion, along with Vanda and Majan, and a few others as well. And I'm going to be moderating session 2, which is titled From Youth Action to Policy Change. And this session will have an introductory presentation by 3 policymakers who will provide examples of successful campaigns and effective policy, and then will be followed by dialogue with youth on how to turn the visions and energy of the youth into effective political action and policy change. So throughout this session, there will be the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen open for you to ask questions to the speakers or the panelists. So please do make use of that. And then when the 3 speeches are over, then we will be getting to those and addressing your questions. So without further ado, I will address our first speaker, which is Professor Dr. Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker from Germany. And he is the Honorary President of the Club of Rome, as well as a past chairman of the German Bundestag Environment Committee. So please take the floor.
Thanks very much. It's wonderful to see so many youth coming in to this international debate. And I must say the 3 panelists today are associated with the United Nations. I was working at the East River in the Center for Science and Technology for Development as the director for policy questions. Okay, but today I'm talking about essentially the agenda of the Club of Rome and what we have to discuss now in the connection of peace. So let me see if that is already working. And this is just a cover page. Okay, yes. Well, youth action was absolutely necessary. It's so important and has impressed, for instance, the new president of the European Union, Mrs. von der Leyen. She was so impressed by the young people saying, and this brought her to a large extent to the new Green European Deal. Okay, but at the same time, while the young are protesting, we see a huge destruction going on. This happens to be the Amazon forest, the lungs of the Americas, but this is only one piece out of 100. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has given a fantastic talk at Columbia University in the US. The state of the planet is broken. And then he complains that, well, for COVID, we have a vaccination available, but not for all the destruction that are happening to the planet. We at the Club of Rome gave our warnings sometime earlier, 1972. I was not member of the club at the time. And that was the first big Club of Rome report, 30 million copies sold in all major languages. But at that time, climate and biodiversity were no issue. In 2018, my friend Anders Wickman from Sweden and myself as co-presidents wrote and coordinated a new major report called Come On. You know, in English language, come on has 2 different meanings. And here I'm reading the 3 chapters. First is, come on. Don't tell me the current trends are sustainable. They are not. They are the opposite of it. Second, come on. Don't stick to outdated philosophies. Those were the ones which created all those troubles. And the third part is then, come on, join us on an exciting journey towards a sustainable world. That is then the policy question. Come on was also a strategy gift to the new co-presidents, 2 wonderful women, Sandrine Dixon de Clercq from Belgium, and Michaela Rampele from South Africa. Well, at the core of that new book, we make the distinction between the empty world and the full world, which is an expression proposed by Herman Daly, who used to be the chief economist of the World Bank. And the evident fact is that the empty world was sustainable and the full world is not. The core of the fact is the world population increase, in particular since 1950 or so, a dramatic increase. And the United Nations have published a report called Consequential Omissions, how demography shapes development. And there they show that strong population growth is almost equivalent to very poor development. So it is better, like you see in East Asia and other parts of the world, to stabilize population, then you are much better off. The full world is now called the Anthropocene. And since 1950, roughly, we see an explosive acceleration. And this is a disaster. And the green pictures show the suffering of the planet. One measure for the Anthropocene is the body weights of land-living vertebrates. 67% of the land-living vertebrates are essentially slaughter animals for our eating. 30% of the body weights is we, humans, leaving a mere tiny 3% for all wild animals combined. Isn't that a disaster? It's totally unsustainable. Okay, the current trends in the full world are in no way sustainable. In summer 18, in Sweden, they had 28 big wildfires. And this was the trigger for Greta Thunberg for going to strike. I got to know her. I met her in Switzerland, and I had a similar talk to give like today's at a meeting with some 450 pupils or activists. And after my talk, they rose to their feet, giving me standing ovations. And Greta Thunberg then came to me, and we had a delightful political chat. So I really am sort of all on the side of the young generation, being 80 years old, you know. But nevertheless, the real heating occurs in the oceans, not on land. Everybody is complaining about wild weather, etc. on land. No. The real event is water, ocean water, meaning that the real scare may soon be the rise of the seawater table. You know, look at this illustration. Italy during the last ice age was a lot larger than today, and during the last hot age was only half the size. Now imagine what that means if global warming affects the seawater table. You know, this is Asia. 800 million people in Asia live directly at the coast. And now imagine the sea level rising by 5 or 10 meters, then we may have 200 million, perhaps 400 million refugees. Imagine what would that mean for Switzerland? Of course, we were very happy with the Paris Climate Agreement, but how do countries respond? The benign countries would say, yes, okay, let's do something on climate, but make no illusion, it's going to be very expensive. So we need a lot more growth. This is the typical response in all countries of the world, including my own. Is that the right answer? No, it's a mad answer. Here are the 8 most important segments of our economies, And in each one of them, you see a near perfect correlation between GDP per person, I mean, in agriculture, in transport, in industry, etc., and carbon dioxide emissions per person. So, in other words, we are reasonably good doctors for diagnosis. We see that global warming is a toxic disease, but we are totally mad doctors for recovery. We systematically suggest treatments that make the disease worse. You know, would you go to such doctors if you're ill? Well, our common mindset among politicians, journalists, business, and most people is exactly this mad attitude: growth heals everything. No, it's wrong in terms of climate. Well, people seem to prefer reassuring lies over the inconvenient truth. I was living in California at the time when Al Gore was vice president of the US, and he published a book, An Inconvenient Truth About Climate. And then he made a film. And then the cartoonist made this picture showing a cinema offering The Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore and a reassuring lie. Where are people going? A reassuring lie, because it is so wonderfully comfortable to be lied. Well, Trump knew exactly that lying can make you popular. Okay. While we sit here comfortably, some 600 new coal power plants are under construction or planned worldwide. 90% of them evidently in developing countries. We can't blame them for that. Hence, effective climate policy must include the developing countries. Otherwise, we are losing the war. And for that, I believe the by far most promising approach is the so-called budget approach, meaning that all countries of the world have an identical permit for polluting the atmosphere per person. But the old industrialized countries, that's the red color curve, have already gobbled up all their permits, so there is nothing left. That's the dotted lines. By 2025, nothing is left for the industrialized countries, the old ones. What can they do? The idea is they should be allowed to trade budgets with developing countries. That's the green color. And that means we would go to Bolivia, to Cameroon, to India or so, asking for some more permits. And they would say, okay, we have some, but it will cost money. So if we do that, and we would go to India, the present Minister of Economic Affairs would soon switch from promoting coal power, which he is presently doing all the time, to renewables and energy efficiency in order to free permits that he can then sell at high cost to the north. So that would get, finally, for the first time in history, a strong economic incentive for developing countries to leave aside coal power plants and instead accelerate renewables and energy efficiency. They could do a lot, actually even more, economic welfare than coal. In common, we then go deeper and say that our civilization is in a philosophical crisis. I mentioned that. We find the same concern in Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, where he declares that the current economy of greed, relentless competition, and wild acceleration is destroying our common home. Responding to the philosophical crisis, we suggest to engage in a new enlightenment, I have no time to expand on that now, but if there are questions, I'm happy to. We have to act now. That's part 3. It's about policy change. We need absolutely dramatic changes in agriculture, energy, transport, circular economy, financial markets, and the tax systems. All those are wrongly directed towards destruction instead of build up. I can't go into details now, but if there is time for discussion, fine. With an Australian team, I published a book called Factor 5, which was also translated into Chinese and other languages, in which we prove that for all relevant economies sectors, a 5-fold increase of energy productivity and indeed material productivity, meaning recyclable products, allow us to completely stop fossil fuels without any loss of prosperity. It's technically feasible. Okay, I think that's all. And now we can begin discussing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your speech. And I definitely think we can all appreciate your very in-depth and holistic approach to this issue. So thank you so much for that. I think if you could stop sharing the screen, I think I'll maybe do that.
Undoing is sometimes more difficult. But anyway, just go on.
Okay, super. So, but I think Wanda, maybe could you stop sharing the screen, or Alan?
Great, yes. If you can do that.
Yeah, because I don't have the.
Perhaps Alan as the host.
Yeah, Alan, could you maybe stop sharing the screen? Yeah,
Okay.
super.
It's done. Thank you.
Well, now we can see each other all again. All right, so thanks to you once again for your great presentation. And now I will go on to introduce our second speaker of the session 2, which is Baroness Sue Miller from the UK. She is a PNND co-president, as well as the vice president of UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global Security and Non-proliferation. So without further ado, Baroness Sue Miller, you can start your talk.
Thank you so much. And it's really a privilege to be able to speak to so many people from so many countries, and many of you decades younger than myself, because one of the depressing things sometimes, and I'm a member of the House of Lords where the average age is 69, is that you feel there is nobody really to pass the baton on to of these very important issues. So to have all these energetic people today, and I really enjoyed the first session, and I'm going to refer quite a bit to that in my talk. Having all this energy from young people really gives me hope. Now, one of the disadvantages of being older is I'm technically not very good. So please tell me if you can't see this. I want to show you a particularly lovely postcard, which some of you will know Monsignor Bruce Kent, who was a great leader in CND, and he sent me this. In case it's not reading clearly, it says, "War causes climate change causes war." And it's such a simple message. And I know in the first session you were talking about that. And this is the postcard from the movement for the abolition of war. He sent it to me in 2016, so I guess they made it a bit before that. But we've had the recognition that the two are interlinked for quite some time. But really not enough has happened in terms of the linkages between the two. One of the questions, and I'm so glad no one had time to answer it, one of the questions was about the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because I think that's really one of the most important things to happen in my lifetime, really, because we've seen the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty have some effect, but then struggle and then become really impotent over the years. Now, Marie-Claire in her presentation talked about global privilege. And I think that is what we're facing, because so many of the nations who signed and ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons are, of course, non-nuclear weapons states. The nuclear weapons states are frightened of the treaty. And I've raised this in Parliament, and the government in the UK just says, well, we want to stick with the Nuclear Non-proliferation Treaty as the main forum for discussing nuclear weapons. But actually, what they really mean is, we want to stick with the status quo. I think that's the problem. And the way that it ties into the global privilege argument is that the nuclear weapons states, of course, feel that as long as they have the nuclear weapons, they'll get a seat on the Security Council and they've got the biggest stick. But it's all about global privilege. And that's why I think it's so important that now we will have, entering into force very shortly, the UN treaty, and that links into something that Nathan was talking about, which is nuclear divestment. Because of course, now that nuclear weapons in international law will be made illegal to own or transport or store or manufacture, it will make it very much easier to bring pressure onto financial institutions to say, well, why are you investing in something that under international law is illegal? And I think that the Don't Bank on the Bomb movement has done really well so far, but it really could take off now, because I think that the treaty will give it wings that it perhaps didn't have before. So you also showed the protests of 1982 and 2019, and it really took me back, because it was in the 70s I started getting involved, because the United States was going to send cruise missiles over to the UK. And I got involved because at the beginning of the 80s, I had young children, and the idea that they would be targets of nuclear weapons or live in a country where there were nuclear weapons was really awful. So I got involved, but I then thought that actually just protesting isn't enough. And so I became more and more involved in politics. And in a way, I'd have to say that's been a little bit disillusioning, because I think we achieved more from just protesting in those early years in the 80s, because the cruise missiles went back to the United States. And since I've been involved in the political sphere, I've just seen us possessing Trident, and which is, of course, our submarine-based nuclear weapons. And the UK is now embarking on a modernization program, along with many other countries of the world who are into all the nuclear weapons states are busy modernizing, and they're going to spend trillions, which does link in, I think, to the issues that all three speakers were speaking about in our first session, and that Professor Ernst has underlined so well in his interesting presentation. Because if we spend that sort of money on those things, just on nuclear weapons, we're not going to have them for all the really critical things that we need to do, like develop green infrastructure, tackle the water issues, change our agriculture to being much more sustainable. So the spend on nuclear weapons is something I think that I would want to put as much energy as I can into, because that's really, given everything else we're facing, even before the pandemic struck, I think is the worst way possible of spending money. Now, the depressing thing in the United Kingdom is that, with the exception of the Scottish Nationalist Party and the Green Party, all three political parties, and I'm a Liberal Democrat, still support owning Trident, and it's because it's become equated with being patriotic, a little bit like the reasons people voted for Brexit. It equals patriotism, we're our own nation, and all the rest. So I think where young people will have a big advantage in getting over that feeling, and bear in mind, the young people were the ones who didn't vote for Brexit. They don't see that patriotism and those issues are the most important. I think that for this issue, young people will see that they have so much in common with their global cohort generations that they will be more and more willing to be active. So I do expect us to get to change, but I think it will only come from the young. I felt Davina's presentation was particularly poignant to me, because often when we're talking about nuclear weapons, we have to go back to the dreadful events of Hiroshima before we get an example of them being used in war, although of course there have been some terrible health effects from the testing. But the issues Davina raised of child soldiers is so very current. And again, I think the reasons that people go to war for lack of resources, for water, for all sorts of reasons, but that generation of child soldiers who's paying the price for our failure, our global failure to make the world a more equitable and fairer place, is such a real and human story that it deserves the widest possible discussion. So sometimes if I'm just in the UK and just with my own generation, I can feel a bit depressed about this issue. But when I hear the sorts of presentations that we're having this afternoon, and I see the energy of young people to overcome these issues, then I feel very hopeful. So I think that as the treaty enters into force and we have a generation who are really adept at talking to each other, and goodness me, hasn't Zoom conferencing really taken off? I, never imagined we could do this even a year ago. So all of those things make me feel hopeful that we will get a bit more change. And I guess in the short term, the other thing that's pretty hopeful is the fact that, of course, tomorrow in the United States, we're going to have a president who is going to be committed to doing at least something about the nuclear treaties which are lapsing, the START treaty, and I think there's a big job to be done there in talking to the states about the issues we're discussing this afternoon, and we just need to gradually chip away at the nuclear weapons states and get ourselves into a position where disarmament becomes something that, because every country says they aspire to it, but none of the nuclear weapons states ever make the steps to get to it. And we need to make the steps to get to it now. So I'm very interested in the rest of the discussion today and the other questions that there will be. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
I need to unmute again. So thank you so much for your presentation and also for your reflections on all the other speakers. I think that we all agree with you in your reflection. So thank you so much for that. And now I will move on to present our third speaker for session 2, Ms. Maria Espinosa from Ecuador, who was their former Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as the President of the UN General Assembly for their 73rd session between 2018 and 19, and is also the chair of the World Future Council Commission on the Rights of Children and Youth. So without further ado, Ms. Espinosa, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for this introduction. Greetings to all. And of course, I would like to start by thanking my dear friend Alan Ware, the Basel Peace Office, Youth Fusion, for this invitation, to participate in this conversation, in this very thought-provoking and exciting forum with young people. It is also a privilege to share this stage and the panel with Professor Weizsäcker and Baroness Miller, and to have the opportunity to exchange ideas with such engaged young activists on some of the most pressing issues of today, such as climate action. We heard extensively already nuclear disarmament and peace and sustainable development. And I think I am deeply convinced that the role of youth can help us to better cope with these unprecedented global challenges, including COVID-19. So I would like to quote UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres when he said that enabling the engagement of youth in formal political mechanisms does increase the fairness of political processes by reducing democratic deficits. It also contributes to better and more sustainable policies, and also has symbolic importance that can further contribute to restore trust in public institutions, especially among youth. And I want to make his words mine because I fully agree with him. So the engagement of youth in political spaces and decision-making processes is of great importance. And I would like to highlight 2 reasons here. First, contrary to the global trend of some societies turning more nationalistic, greedy, closed on themselves, and averse to international action and multilateralism, young people have shown the opposite. They are more cosmopolitan, internationally oriented, open-minded, and better networked. And I think Baroness Miller has already mentioned that. So one has to look at for example, there are several cases, numbers, looking at the voting behavior of the last elections and referenda around the world, to find that young people express more environmentally and socially sustainable political positions, rejecting at the same time xenophobic, nationalistic, and anti-globalization agendas. And this is, there is proof. I have several examples, but perhaps I won't, go into the detail. So in this fashion, I think that the future of multilateralism and collective action to fight the climate crisis, nuclear proliferation, weapons, sorry about that. I don't know if it's me or not, but I was saying that collective action to fight climate, nuclear proliferation, weapons of mass destruction, and our complex in favor of peace, democracy, human rights, and sustainable development depend, perhaps today more than ever, on the engagement of youth in political action. And the second reason is self-preservation, of course. While those powerful politicians, businessmen, statesmen that deny climate change sometimes and do not seem to take seriously the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic or the erosion of the multilateral system, will perhaps not live to face the catastrophic consequences of this negligence. Young people will, without doubt, face the consequences of today's wrong decisions during their lifetime. It is therefore imperative that you take part in the political construction of tomorrow's world. I'm totally convinced, and I'm so happy that there's so many young people in the audience today. So given the time constraints, I would like to focus my intervention perhaps on the issue of disarmament and how it connects to sustainable development and to climate as well. So I think that despite of the fact that COVID-19 pandemic is bringing about the worst global economic and social crisis since the Great Depression, and a scenario not far from the end of the Second World War, we observe that many countries are directing vast fiscal resources to nuclear deterrence strategies, even in spite of a big global recession. For example, the US defense budget for 2021 includes $15.3 billion in spending for their nuclear weapons programs. The French government, for example, presented a 2021 draft defense budget which set aside 5 billion euros for nuclear deterrence. So we are all aware, and this audience know very, very clearly that nuclear weapons can bring our end as a species, that they are not effective as a deterrent strategy, nor as a means of strategic stability, and that they increase human insecurity. And nevertheless, the levels in nuclear weapons spending are still high. Just a year before the pandemic, in 2019, it reached $73 billion worldwide. It is also upsetting that while 2 billion people in the world do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, and 690 million people suffer from chronic hunger, world military expenditure in 2019 reached $1.9 trillion, which is 2.2% of our global GDP. So a new post-Cold War high record. So we are not learning from history. I heard, loud and clear Baroness Miller saying in the UK, unfortunately, the nuclear weapon discussion is about being nationalistic, loving the country, which is very hard to understand, but I can, connect to your comment. So I think that in this context, I would like to stress the importance of advancing the advocacy and multilateral action towards disarmament. From a human security point of view, disarmament measures are the ones bringing about international, national, and regional peace, stability, and security. Moving forward, disarmament and arms control is vital, and we already know that for achieving the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and delivering on sustaining peace for all. Disarmament, and this is also not a secret, plays an important role in the fight against climate change. We all know that the production, testing, and use of weapons, as well as military operations, pose one of the largest contributions to carbon emissions. In this sense, disarmament can play a key role in climate protection, as well as protecting people's livelihoods. So the expenditure and resources currently dedicated to weapon production and the military can be redirected to supporting climate stabilization and sustainable development. And here again, I would like to quote Itsumi Nakamitsu, the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. And she said, very wisely, if only 10% of today's global military spending were spent towards SDG 13 on climate action, the current costs of adapting to climate change, for example, in developing countries, in my part of the world, would be covered several times over. So it is not a lack of resources. It is a lack of the right political choices. Compared to the fast-paced increase in world military expenditures, green measures, and this is very important because young activists have to follow up on this. You know, green measures account for less than 0.2% of the total coronavirus related stimulus spending worldwide. And this, I'm referring to the 50 largest economies. So more than ever, I am convinced that political will and not finance is the key to contain economic greed and policy negligence, including on disarmament. So I think that to build back better a post-COVID-19 global governance, a more inclusive and sustainable international response needs to address disarmament, peace and security from an intergenerational perspective. And I would like to only close today with two takeaways because I'm really looking forward to the questions and the conversation. Two takeaways. Number one, efforts toward disarmament should make full use of the power, the commitment, the voice and agencies of young leaders. Intergenerational decision-making has proven to be extremely efficient and powerful. You have the traction, the knowledge, and the legitimacy to act. And the number two takeaway, I think that we need to wisely use the momentum for advancing the disarmament agenda and seriously address the implementation deficit that we have. The COVID-19 recovery packages should be connected to de-investing in weapons of all kinds. We have the opportunity to see the UN disarmament agenda taken seriously. We need to use the historic opportunity of the entering into force of the nuclear weapons ban treaty in the coming days, and this to boost the nuclear disarmament agenda, of course. So the billions wasted in the arms race in general, and nuclear weapons in particular, could very well serve our efforts to fight poverty, inequalities, and the climate crisis for building back better. And for that, we need leadership. And I am not a believer in, you know, messianic leaders, only heads of state and government, but collective leadership, you know, from all paths of social life. Parliaments have a critical role to play, young activists, academia, and of course the UN family. So we must always remember that peace and sustainability are political choices. Peace should not be a utopia, but rather an inspiring force to act and transform. And that requires, of course, the agency and action, not only from, as mentioned, governments, political leaders, but from you, young thinkers, activists, from women. You know, I'm a huge defender on the role and agency of women and girls in peacemaking and sustaining peace. And I'm so happy once again to be here among so many young activists and change makers. Thank you, Michaela, for this space, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Espinosa, for your very inspiring talk. I think a lot of the youth here today are very inspired by your words, and especially your emphasis on this intergenerational decision-making and the youth's role in leading our future and the future that we want. So thank you so much. And I hope that everyone else, as myself was very inspired by your talk. So now we're going to get on to the interesting part of the session, where there will be some question and answers. So I'm just going to read out one that was asked in the previous session, but has now got some answers. So someone was asking, with the new US administration re-entering the climate agreement, do you think that they will accept the linkages between these issues and start divesting from its huge military budget? Baroness had also replied saying that the Paris Accords is a hopeful start if the US rejoins that, which I think we can all agree on. And Alan has also put a comment with some useful information that states the US Congress sets the military budget. There are a couple of Congress initiatives that might get some traction now. The Democrats have majority. One is the smarter approach to nuclear expenditure, which is SANE, Act introduced by Senator Markey. Another is the new Congress 10% caucus calling for 10% reduction in the military spending to address the pandemic. And then there's also a link for those of you who are interested in reading more about this in the Q&A session. And then on to the other questions from this session. Nico Edwards has a question to Baroness Sumela asking, drawing on your frustration with making change happen through parliamentary action, what role can you see that politics will have in shaping the possibilities for change, including disarmament, in the coming years? How can we make politics a constructive avenue for progressive dialogue once again?
I think that's a very interesting question, because the role of the political parties, if it's working well, is that their membership should bring pressure on the leadership about issues they're concerned with. And of course, one of PNND's co-presidents was for some time leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. But actually his party got more and more nervous about nuclear disarmament because they felt, again, it was a very much a vote loser. But so I think the first thing is to get involved politically. You don't necessarily have to join the party, but you can write to people. If you join the party, you begin to get more influence in it, any party. And if that's your single issue, then you can pursue it very relentlessly. Political parties are, all of them, are very sensitive to the feedback from emails and Twitter and so on. So I think that what's being said on social media now is really important. So make sure that you're using your social media to its absolutely best effect. And question every time some MP votes for something, they can be questioned about it. Every time there is a debate you agree with, somebody makes a good point, then you can just mention that and say that, you know, whoever it was made a really good point. Joanne Smith made an excellent point on that day. You know, read her speech. Because the other thing I found, and I'm not looking for sympathy at all, but if you're taking a different position than most of your colleagues, it's quite a lonely place. So nuclear disarmament has for years not been well supported in the UK. So it's really nice occasionally to get a tweet from somebody or a comment, or even I got a card actually from somebody saying, I'm really glad you raised the UN Treaty on the Prohibition. You know, it made my week. Well, actually, it made my week to get the card, because it's very rare that somebody would be bothered to put pen to paper, but we all need re-motivating from time to time. But to wrap up that one, I think it's get involved in any way you can. And, you know, the power of social media these days is something I probably still don't appreciate enough, but you all will, all the younger generations. So, you know, you cannot use it too much on this issue. Thank you, Michaela.
Well, thank you very much for your very comprehensive answer. So I hope we all youths here take note of that to get clicking away. Then there was another question from Linda Walker, who's asking all of the panelists, so whichever panelist would like to answer, then you can go ahead, or multiple, but it's asking, how do the speakers think we can make nuclear disarmament and shift the resources from the military as being an integral part of the agenda for COP26 for both states taking part and campaigners coming together around the conference? So I think the question is mainly asking, how do we shift the money from the military budgets towards nuclear disarmament and using COP26 to do that.
Let me make one remark about Donald Trump. He had the opinion that countries, by definition, are rivals against each other. This is a wrong concept. I believe humanity rose to higher cultural levels by cooperation. Once this philosophy, which I hope is with Joe Biden and others, prevails, it will be a lot easier shifting money from war to peace.
Thank you for that. Is there anyone of the other panelists who would like to comment?
Just briefly to say that certainly in the UK, some of the best supporters of nuclear disarmament are in fact people in the military, because they don't want to see tactical nuclear weapons arriving. They see bigger nuclear weapons stealing money from conventional arms, and that is very dangerous because you could escalate to a nuclear war more quickly. So actually the conventional military chaps are very often a voice in favor of nuclear disarmament, although they can't obviously say anything much until they're retired. But we do have some of the retired ones in the Lords who are quite vocal on this.
Super, and I think, is that all we have for this question, or?
Can I say something, please? Andy Nidecker. I would like to alert everybody to a book by a British woman, Cilla Elworthy, certainly known to Baroness Sue Miller. She has produced a book, The Business Plan for Peace, and she lists all the global, the numbers for militarism and versus the much smaller and tiny number of, tiny figure of money needed for social programs. And it's worthwhile to perhaps get a copy of this book, Business Plan for Peace, because it deals exactly with the problem of militarism versus social and expenditures. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, yeah, for that. Sorry, but the link is just in the chat if anyone wants to look into that book. And go ahead, Ms. Espinosa.
Okay, no, I just wanted to thank Andreas for just reminding us about the incredible book from Sheila Elworthy. We are both counselors to the World Future Council, and it is a privilege, you know, to know her and know her work. I think it's really a must-read piece. And it responds exactly to the question that was just posed, but I just wanted to say something and to add something to the conversation. I don't know if it's my computer or not. I don't think so, because I have everything on silence mode, but anything can happen with technology. So sorry if it's on my side. But in any case, what I wanted to say is that citizens' engagement, informed engagement and participation is critical to this. When Sue said, you know, even Corbyn's party, they were starting to be nervous about, you know, their pledge for nuclear disarmament because, you know, it had a political cost and an impact in the votes at the end of the day. And that is really worrisome. And I think we need to touch the minds and souls of society, of the voters. And I think that, again, young activists have a critical role to play. And, you know, what worries me is that we are unable, you know, to learn from history, to learn from experience. And yet again, we hear, you know, the European Union saying, you know, we are supporting a European Green Deal, which is very encouraging. But we see some members of the European Union going back to the same old, meaning directing even, you know, the rescue packages, the the recovery COVID packages, yet again on fossil fuels, for example, on industries that are carbon intensive. We are in some countries that are still struggling with coal, for example. And I think that, again, it is a matter of political choice. And the second issue that worries me, not only that we do not learn from experience, and the climate crisis is an issue of survival. We know that. We have, the data, the information, the science, but still, we are not able to take the bold decisions that are needed. And the second issue that worries me is that looking at the global survey, value survey from Edelman in 2020, you see that the lack of trust of people in general and of young people in institutions and political parties is staggering. People do not trust democratic institutions, do not trust, political parties, parliaments, government. And, the numbers in the case of Latin America, because I can remember that number, 13% of the population in Latin America trust political parties. And, this is Latino Barometer information, is out there. It means that we have a lot of work to do to restore trust in democratic institutions, restore trust in politics and political parties. It is vital, not only for democracy, but to make sure that, politicians and leaders are taking informed and wise political choices, including disarmament.
Thank you for that. And I think there's another question that is also sort of building on what you've just said and is also addressed to you, Ms. Espinosa, that's asking, given that we know the real issue is not a lack of resources, but a lack of the right political decisions and overall policy negligence, as you say, how do we circumvent this impasse in global and national decision-making? What would be one key avenue of action to governments and policy makers to make the right political decisions instead of continuing the wrong ones?
Well, that is, not an easy question to answer. And we have very seasoned, diplomats and politicians here. But I would like to repeat what I said. I think that, citizenship, the exercise of citizenship, of public participation, of informed, voting. We are the ones electing the leaders that guide our destiny, but at the same time, we do have agency and responsibility as citizens as well. I am a strong believer on shared leadership, on collective leadership, not only messianic leaders, heads of state. I mean, it is on us as well. Before starting this meeting, I was taking part of it's called the Ubuntu Advisors of the UCLG, which is the municipal movement. We were speaking there precisely what is the role of local governments to strengthen democracy, to strengthen, the public, which includes public opinion. And I think awareness raising, education, as Sue was saying before, participation, advocacy. And I think we are also, we have the opportunity to collectively shape what I call a narrative of hope. We should not dismay, as late Kofi Annan used to say, I'm a stubborn optimist. We cannot just sit and wait, but we have to act. And I'm hopeful, in spite of COVID, the climate crisis, the extinction crisis, I still have hope because we have voices like Michaela and so many young people and activists. We have the Greta Thunbergs. We have so many young people out there. And before, it's like they were conveying their message through the adults and decision making. Now you have your own voice. You have your own spaces. You have the Fridays for Climate. You have listening here, in the highest levels, and platforms at the UN. I quoted Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and I think we need to use the vibrance of the moment for the voices and the agency of youth.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very nice summary of the question asked. And now we have another question. We still have a few more minutes to take a few more questions. So this one is asking, even with the entry into force of the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty, what is the realistic future of nuclear disarmament/ban, considering that all of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council with the primary responsibility to peace and rife nuclear powers? So I think it's just asking sort of the question of what the question of the UN Security Council in regard to a nuclear disarmament.
For myself, I think it'll still be a really hard, difficult struggle, partly because many countries are still very suspicious of China and Russia. And they do not look as though they're going to be having a good democratic situation anytime soon. I think some of it is back to what Ernst said very wisely about countries seeing each other as rivals, and we've got to get beyond that, because actually the threats are not from our rivals, they are from things like the pandemic or the lack of water, or the lack of food, as it will be if climate change takes a big hold. I think in the short term it will be really difficult, but I do go back to the point we were making about the money. If we can only get people to shift their investment, their pension plan money, their money in banks and so on, away from nuclear weapons manufacturers, that will be a really good start. But I think for politicians, sorry, dog. The dog has not unmuted herself. I think it will be very difficult. So I'll leave it there because the dog wants to say too much.
Thank you. And I think we will understand what having pets is like on Zoom meetings. You can't unmute them. But then we'll, unless anyone else wants to.
Yes, I would like to make one more remark. You know, the establishment of the United Nations, including the Security Council, was at the time when every economist and every ordinary person believed that power also means more energy. And there was a very close neighborhood between peaceful nuclear power and military nuclear power, because there was a common understanding that you are strong if you have a lot of power in terms of electricity and power in terms of military. That made it almost impossible for anybody to stand back and say, well, let's disarm, etc. This was kind of related to suicide. Today, I mean, this is the philosophy of Factor 5. Today, we can prove that this assumption of the 1950s is wrong, and that inside energy, a kilowatt hour photovoltaics is cheaper than a kilowatt hour of nuclear. That makes it a lot more plausible for a new generation of politicians to look after disarmament.
Thank you very much for that answer. And I think we have one more question in the Q&A box that is asking about the relationship between the sort of nuclear fathers, I'm guessing in reference to the US and Russia. And it's asking, how do you engage the nuclear fathers and protagonists to stop nuclear buildups? Does anyone want to have a go at that, the big question?
Well, just to say, we have got members of Parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament in those countries. There are more young people elected to Congress. Perhaps we should be writing to people like AOC and asking her where she stands on this. I mean, there are people with a different vision for the states. I'm not qualified to speak on Russia because I never really have engaged with Russia, but I think it's a really good question. And there is certainly more we could be doing with the United States, especially at the moment. Yeah, but Russia and China, I think, will be more difficult. And of course, I mean, the other thing is that even with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, America broke that with India because it agreed that it could go ahead and do things which actually were contrary to the treaty, and India's never joined. So I think we need to actually make politicians in every country see the seriousness of this. And let's hope the Biden era is a new era, and we need to start engaging at least with the states with lots of energy. Sorry, I can't comment on Russia.
Yeah, Andreas, do you have something?
Just a small comment at the end. When we talk about nuclear weapons, let's not forget the small arms. They cause a lot of harm in South America and in Africa, a harm which increases tremendously the social costs in the hospital and leaves behind many injured and traumatized young people. So let's talk about nuclear arms and all arms in our discussions in the future. Just wanted to make that comment.
Well, I think unless any of the panelists have anything else to say, then I will close up the question and answer session. And before I go, I would just also like to say a big thank you to all the panelists for answering the questions and for your very inspiring talks. And also to everyone who has stuck around to join session 2. And I hope that you're all very inspired. I know that I definitely am. So now for the last 5 or so minutes of session 2, Alan is going to say some closing remarks now. So I'll pass the floor over to him.
Well, thank you very much, Michaela. And I'm just going to give a couple of reflections on the 2 sessions. Firstly, the ones we had 3 young speakers talking about issues of, a range, climate change, key issue, child soldiers, a conflict in Africa and the engagement of children there, and nuclear disarmament, and the links between those. And to me, that session was very inspiring to see not only that, young people are addressing these issues, but they're taking action. And it was really good to see that there was positive action there. And to me, that was a message that also came from the second session, where we heard from the people who've been really engaged for some time in these issues. And sometimes that can lead to a bit of frustration that we, you know, have known about many of these issues for a long time. We've put forward reports. You know, Dr. Weizsäcker said the Club of Rome report was many years ago, and it's taken quite a long time. On the other hand, positivity is there are some things that are happening. There are some policies that have been put into place. There is a greater cross-fertilization and cooperation, you know, between these different issues. And I think like a main message coming out of session 2 to young people was, well done for raising these issues. Don't give up on democratic processes. There may have been, we know there's problems, you know, whether it's in national politics with some corruption and power politics, also in international, in the UN, there's also some problems with the Security Council dominated by, you know, these military powerful countries. But still we see some shining examples of policies coming forward at local, national and international levels. And Maria Espinosa was the president of the UN General Assembly that did amazing things, you know, during the time that she was the president. And it wasn't blocked by the military powerful 5 countries because they can't block the General Assembly, nor that can they block the International Court of Justice, which has come out, and this relates to the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons and the obligation to disarm. And even if the nuclear armed states don't join immediately this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, they are obligated under international law, affirmed by both the International Court of Justice and the UN Human Rights Committee, to refrain from the threat or use of nuclear weapons and to work for complete disarmament. So these were 2 key aspects of the United Nations that have done a lot, even, you know, through the more democratic process of, in the UN General Assembly, 1 country, 1 vote. In the Human Rights Committee, the force of law and the power of civil society really, you know, moved that forward. So to me, these are hopeful signs to youth. You know, look for opportunities, whether it's with your local parliamentarian or your local mayor, or some other parliamentarians if they're not exactly in your locale, because there are parliamentarians that are trying to do good work. Look to work with them, look to possibilities through the United Nations, and look to Youth Fusion, which I think is a good first landing ground for young people to go to, because Youth Fusion is providing like these opportunities for youth engagement in these different processes. And there's lots of really good ways of doing that. And also to keep up the social media on these issues. As we've seen from the climate issue, it was youth using social media that actually then finally got policymakers to say, hey, we have to do something. So the combination of using the new forms of social media and the more traditional forms of going to meetings, now they're online meetings, and you know, you can still do advocacy to your mayor or your city council or to your parliamentarian through online meetings. It doesn't have to be physical meetings. Combining these can help us move forward. And then be inspired also by some of the wonderful examples. You know, we've seen them. I mean, we have Costa Rica, for example, has demonstrated how a country can provide security, can resolve conflicts between its neighbors without an army. They purposely decided to abolish the armed forces. It freed up resources for their country to invest in education and social welfare. So in Central America, they're like one of the best. Even though they didn't have natural wealth in terms of, you know, resources to be pulled from the ground, they have social wealth and have then been an incredible contributor to disarmament and peace globally as well. And this is just one example. With regards to action to cut military budgets in order to assist with the pandemic, Thailand, South Korea both took action to cut the military budgets by about 10% in order to address the pandemic. In the US, there's the 10% caucus, which is a caucus of congressional members from both the Senate and the House that have said the US should take the same thing, you know, approach, cut the military budget by at least 10% to deal with the pandemic and sustainable development. So there's good examples, there are initiatives on the nuclear weapons divestment, which Baroness Sue Miller raised. There are a lot of this is happening at city level and at individuals, you know, stopping banking with banks that are invested in nuclear weapons, or going to their cities and getting city resolutions that cities won't invest in nuclear weapons. But it's also happening at federal level. And 4 governments, New Zealand, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, and Norway, have actually ended all investments of public funds, like the sovereign wealth funds, the government pension funds, and other government funds in the nuclear weapons industry. This is also happening a lot with fossil fuels, and there are many examples of universities, cities stopping investment in fossil fuels as well. And the campaigns are working together on that. So there's lots of examples that we can build on. And to me, that gives hope, you know, that we have energy and vitality of youth. We have good examples of some excellent policies that you can follow. And there are people within the different political bodies, whether it's United Nations, government bodies, parliaments, that we can engage with to take this forward. So I encourage all the young people engaged in this, keep going, look out for the partnerships, and all those not so young to welcome this engagement that we're having with youth. And these partnerships can be very valuable. And thank you very much again to the 3 young youth speakers in the first session and the more experienced speakers in the second session. And I'll pass it back to Michaela, because I know everybody is looking forward to, after having a short break, to come back and to hear from the 6 finalists for the Pacey Award, and then to participate in the voting. So thank you very much, and I pass over to Michaela just to say where to from here.
Yes, thank you, Alan, and thank you for your reflections as well. And now what's going to happen is that we'll all take a break, and then after that, Mazan is going to host the voting, and she will also give you clear instructions as to how to do this when the time comes. So everyone can relax and go on the break, and then when we come back, then the voting will be explained to you. So everyone is free now, and then we'll see you back again at, well, it's 15 minutes, so at 6 o'clock. Thank you so much for chairing it so beautifully, Michaela. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you also for all your love.
And yeah, we will stay on for the high point of the event, of course.
Yeah, we'll just leave this open for people. So, yep, you can just take a little break, but leave your connection on.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you again, and thank you.
Okay, see you all soon.